much, Reem. Thank you, Dr. Hussein, Ms. Jane, Dr. Mustafa, for the very valuable intro and reminders about the status and what we're hoping for in today's discussion. So I think we're in very exciting times now because this study was previously conducted in 2015. And back then, there wasn't much awareness about climate change. But now, I think more than ever, discussions on all levels in the street, the layman is talking about climate change and asking about it. And this is quite motivating, but also an opportunity for us to revisit all the studies and all the efforts that were done before and see how to accelerate it this year in light of the rapid development and awareness. So that's whether in e-mobility or in other topics such as plastics and e-waste and many things that the development organizations are working on, whether UNHABITAT or CEDARE or others. So as discussed, we will start off our this presentation with the fuel economy report. And this is basically this is an effort that started back in 2015 as we were monitoring the increase in gasoline consumption, which is linearly related to CO2 emissions. As we observe throughout, for example, the 10 years from 2005 to 2015, back then, gasoline consumption had doubled. And similar figures were found for diesel fuel, and similar figures were found in many other things that are symptoms of economic growth, which is expected. And as Jane was explaining, what we aim for is to explore how, in parallel to curbing this growth, also improving the efficiency of vehicles. And here we will start off talking about light-duty vehicles, so cars basically, and then I will walk you through how this discussion is leading to buses and collective transport as well. So just quickly as a reminder, the Global Fuel Economy Initiative targets had a baseline in 2005, and it was basically saying that we want to reduce the fuel consumption per 100 kilometers by 2020, compared by the baseline in all new cars in the OECD countries by 30%. We will reduce by 50% by 2030 for all new cars globally. So when I say all new cars, it means all new sales, okay? And this is different from all the stock of cars. So that's the more ambitious target, so 50% by 2050, not of all new cars, but now of all the cars that are circulating in the country. So these are basically the three key targets that the Global Fuel Economy Initiative is working towards. So how does Egypt fare in terms of emissions? So what we did back in 2015 is look at all of the vehicles in Egypt, all of the models, brands, and engine sizes, and all the data that would give us the equivalent fuel economy of each new car being sold. And we are looking at the average fuel economy for all new sales. So back in 2015, Egypt was hovering below 8 liters per 100 kilometers. Then over the years, it gradually went down to around 7 liters per 100 kilometers, indicating an improvement. However, as we compare to Tunisia and Morocco, for example, we see that there is more efficient vehicles. The vehicle stock there is also newer in general. And then we're always comparing to the 4 liters per 100 kilometer target, global target. And then what happened in 2022 is that we asked the following question. So over the past 7 years, are we seeing an improvement or not? So an update has been made for Egypt. And the next slide is the answer to this question. So what we find in the red line that you see here is that Egypt actually continued a gradual decline that had reached 6 liters per 100 kilometers. Now you might be asking about emissions, carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are linearly related to to the fuel consumption. So that's about 140 grams per kilometer. This indicates a good improvement in the new sales of cars for many reasons, a lot of which are related to the actual efficiency from the original equipment manufacturers, and also the incentives that are provided abroad with regards to carbon reduction and improvement of vehicles, and also reduction of weight of vehicles and so on. And this had a ripple effect on Egypt. So although there are not much emission-related targets put in place, such as a fee-based system, fees and rebates, or low emission zones, and etc. Although this is not in place as policies, the product that is reaching the market in Egypt, whether it's being imported or assembled locally, is eventually improving in alignment with the global trends. So the answer is yes. We have gone down from about 7 to 6 liters per 100 liters per 100 kilometers, and gradually approaching the global target. So this is about fuel efficiency of new car sales. And then the next question is, and maybe this is where UNHABITAT jumps in, because UNHABITAT is concerned with sustainable cities. So we take these results and ask, what are the implications for cities? And here I would refer to a recent report that was also issued between the partners, the Ministry of Environment, CEDARE, and Preet Shepard Foundation, on low emission zone schemes. In this report, policy recommendations included the labeling of different models of different cars in Egypt, and starting to have incentives for entrance into the city of cleaner vehicles, and disincentives, such as fees, for polluting cars or higher emitting cars. And the challenge there was that we do not have a labeling system yet. However, when we are looking at the data, we find that there is a very strong correlation between engine size and fuel economy. And just as we do with the custom duties in Egypt, a similar approach can be done with regards to engine size until we can manage to have a scheme for fuel economy labeling in place in Egypt in order to put into effect schemes such as fee-based systems or low emission zone schemes and so on. So if you look at car sales by engine size and the total car sales, we find that there is a continuous increase in vehicles. Of course, there's a periods where you have slumps throughout history, whether for political turbulence or the pandemic or so on. But in general, there is a continuous increase in car sales, which has in 2021 exceeded 200,000 cars. The majority of the engine size group that we find is between 1.5 and 1.6 liters. So how does this compare to fuel economy? It is quite correlated in many ways. So as we increase in engine size, we also find an increase in the average fuel economy that we calculated for the actual new sales in Egypt. So once more, divided by model and brand and engine size and so on, the equivalent fuel economy sales data, and we get the weighted average. So this is the actual data for Egypt. So we find an increase by engine size quite correlated with fuel economy. Of course, SUVs, the last two bars here, also indicate the exceptionally high fuel consumption of these types of heavy vehicles, the sports utility vehicles. So what are fuel economy labels? We can have a quick look at examples from other countries, whether in the States or in Latin America, such as Brazil, or in Asia, such as South Korea and Singapore, India, China, New Zealand, or in or in other countries as well, such as many countries in Europe. We find that it is a common practice and good practice to have fuel economy labeling, which is something that has been tried in Egypt in other types of products. So maybe Brazil is a bit familiar to Egyptians that are listening into this webinar, because in Brazil, this fuel economy label, as an example, is something that we have been seeing in the recent years in Egypt, not in cars, but rather in home appliances, such as refrigerators, ACs, and so on. So this is in a nutshell what is needed as a prerequisite to start moving towards having a database of emission classes, and in turn being able to implement different schemes such as fee-based systems or low emission zones. And these are precisely the key recommendations, starting fuel economy labeling schemes such as we have for home appliances, implementation of fee-based systems, and this is discussed more in the report, scrapping programs, vehicle scrapping and recycling. And I would like to stop for a second as I'm talking about scrapping programs, because one of the frequently asked questions to everyone advocating climate interventions in transport, one common question is, the automotive industry is a big employer in Egypt, and some climate interventions are threatening the automotive industry. And here we can say something very simple. The emissions are not necessarily related to the number of vehicles in the streets, okay? And in a bit, we're going to be listening to a speaker from Luxembourg, for example, which have more than 10 times the number of vehicles per 1,000 persons. And the same goes to other European countries. So it's not the number of vehicles, but how much you are consuming these vehicles and how efficient are they. And here, scrapping programs can help improving the fuel economy of the vehicle stock in the streets. And also it can help incentivize the automotive industry to move towards cleaner cars and maintain its business and its growth and its employment generation. So these are not two things that should necessarily go against each other, but rather automotive industries in many countries are actually advocating fuel economy interventions and policies and so on. So scrapping programs. Moving on, electric vehicle targets, like Jane was mentioning, we need to have clear targets for electric vehicles. Currently, the number of cars that are electric in Egypt do not make a dent in the average fuel economy. And the penetration rate of electric cars is quite low. So what we need to plan for over the next decade is, and what we need to remind ourselves about, is that it's not electric cars alone that will be the answer, but we have more than 9 million liters, more than 9 billion rather, liters of gasoline being consumed, and the growth is continuing, and this has to be addressed in parallel to electric vehicle targets. Moving on, low emission zone schemes, and this is something that we can find in a report that is also available online on low emission zones, advocating the introduction of this concept in Egypt, as we are currently improving the intelligent transport system across the country. And by ITS, I can refer to, for example, having toll stations around Greater Cairo metropolitan area, which is the case right now. And we are starting for the first time to have the facilities that would enable us to enforce and implement a low emission zone scheme, whether in Cairo or in a couple of other cities in Egypt that also have proper ITS systems under development. So these are low emission zone schemes. Of course, in parallel, diesel fuel sulfur reduction is key to improving air quality, and talking about fuel economy in cars does not mean much if we're talking to the overarching and overshadowing impact of buses and fuel, which happens to be very high in sulfur content in Egypt. Being high in sulfur content in Egypt means that you cannot have emission control devices. And this is why we're starting to see conversion to CNG on the short run, and electric transport on the long run. So moving on, we are actually talking today about buses. So one very important reminder, and once UNHABITAT is concerned with cities, we ask ourselves, so how does this relate to cities? So moving on from fuel economy, efficiency, and EV targets, we need to remind all stakeholders that even efficient cars and even electric cars, they are still cars, and they still take up space in the city. And as I just mentioned, we have more than 200,000 cars hitting the streets in Egypt, only in the past years, 200,000 cars, with all the implied needs for public space. Public space that can otherwise be allocated for other services and other green vegetative cover in the city to treat the heat island effect, allocated to cyclists and pedestrians, and so on, and more sustainable modes, and so on. And thus we move on to the discussion of beyond cars and efficiencies and electric cars, how can we move towards collective transport in order to have consistency in the policies that are being made and not looking at just one aspect. So electric cars are still cars, even if it's zero emission. Public conservation is going to be, is currently one of the key priorities of the activities of UNHABITAT, building on this work that CEDARE has been working on over the past decade. Promotion of measures to conserve public space, such as incentivizing smaller vehicles, maybe micro vehicles, and enforcing parking restrictions and encouraging collective transport, among a wide array of other measures in parallel to promoting of EVs, but rather in the form of shared vehicles rather than single occupancy vehicles, shared systems. And this leads us to part two, moving on to bus systems and setting the stage for today. So bus systems, and what are we doing? One important thing to remember throughout our panel discussions today is that we're not just rallying for electric buses, but we're looking at the bigger picture, zooming out and looking at the carbon emission reduction at the level of the city. And here we always remind are we talking about a technology shift or also a mode shift, which in many cases can be more important? So for example, if you're comparing fossil fuels, such as compressed natural gas or such as diesel, comparing it with electric buses, having a shift in technology is not the end of the story. But the next question is how many of the occupants of the buses are coming from cars? And here the role of UNHABITAT in its activities is to ensure that there are sufficient upgrades in the transport system and the enabling urban environment so as to attract car users, single occupancy car users. We refer to last mile solutions and last mile experiences, and also all of the policies that relate to not changing the technology, but rather changing the lifestyles and to collective transport, whether it is CNG or even better battery electric. So in many cases, there can be an overshadowing effect in the technology shift. And this is a theme that we will be getting back to as we move on with the panel discussions. So when we study something like New Cairo, and many of the listeners are thinking about, the new settlements in Egypt, can we knock on the door of one of the villas there and tell them, please use the bus? And the answer is no. If you look at the catchment areas of bus stations in New Cairo, we will find that within 400 and 800 meters, there are no last mile solutions, and there's limited shading and limited streetscape that allows an enjoyable experience to reach your bus, whether it is electric or natural gas. That might not be an issue for you to leave your car. And here, mode shift is a key word that needs to be understood. And this is our role when we are discussing development in the city beyond the technology of one specific mode. First and last mile solutions, or only mile solutions, integration of different mobility options, and improvement of the quality of life in the city, that would allow people to exit their shuttle of a private car and start interacting with their city in more sustainable, a couple of projects that we are working on, for example, is the bike sharing system that is being implemented currently in Cairo. And this is a contribution to the diversity of solutions for first and last mile solutions. And it's also a very important contribution to buses as well, since bike sharing and a lot of non-motorized transport options and the various feeder systems are catering to the bus systems that we are talking about today. They are not only helping them in terms of ridership, but also who is riding the bus. Is this someone who is coming from an abandoned car, which is ideal for the emission reduction, or otherwise? So soon you will be seeing a station, a launch of a station in Tahrir Square, moving on in different parts of Egypt, of small size and medium size stations that have 28 bikes, distributed in different areas across Greater Cairo and integrated with the metro line and the bus systems, such as some of you know, Abdel Menam Riyadh and other bus stations, to facilitate not only regular ridership, but ridership of people who would otherwise be using a car, and improving the first and last mile solution. Other projects as an example, is something that we will talk more about today in one of the panels, the bus rapid transit system that we are working on between connecting new urban communities with Greater Cairo. And here the example is the 6th of October BRT, connecting the 6th of October with Giza. This is a 42-kilometer mega project with segregated lanes for BRT that is achieving the criteria of gold standard BRT. And the reason we are going to focus in our panels on what the gold standard is, silver and so on, is to remind and discuss everything that I've been talking about today, all of the enabling criteria that make the experience of using buses enjoyable, and thus taking in users that would otherwise be using cars. Whether the bus is CNG, diesel, or electric, the climate impact is to a large extent not only related to the technology, but to the entire quality of the experience of the computers that we are trying to upgrade. So if there's one takeaway from this presentation, it would be that the climate intervention with regards to bus systems is not related to technology alone. It is related to the entire experience of the city that would suck in the car users to start shifting towards and being attracted to using the diversity of collective transport that is available. And for this, we will also be listening more down the line today to our speaker from the ITDP, who was the main consultant actually in the BRT designs, about the different criteria associated with the different levels of BRT standards. Thank you very much.